Calculated terror. 8 methods of execution. Inside Mexico's drug cartels. Cold open, black screen, ambient sound of static. There are wars fought with armies, and there are wars fought with fear. The conflict waged by Mexico's most powerful drug cartels belongs to the second category. What you are about to witness is not myth, not urban legend, and not speculation. Every case documented in this film has been verified through federal court testimony, forensic evidence, and sealed judicial records from proceedings in both Mexico and the United States. These are not stories of impulsive violence. They are accounts of calculated, methodical terror, designed not simply to eliminate enemies, but to send a message so grotesque, so irreversible, that it would reshape the psychological landscape of an entire nation. This is what that message looked like. Chapter 1. The 36-hour interrogation. Guadalajara, Mexico, February 1985. By the early winter of 1985, DEA Special Agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena had accomplished something that most law enforcement professionals considered impossible. Working deep undercover inside the Guadalajara cartel, the most powerful trafficking organization in Mexico at the time, he had identified and coordinated the destruction of El Búfalo, a clandestine marijuana plantation in the highlands of Chihuahua, stretching across thousands of acres, containing an estimated 2,500 metric tons of product. It was, at that moment, the single most damaging blow ever dealt to cartel boss Rafael "Caro" Quintero's criminal empire. 3 days later, Caro Quintero began his response. On February 7, 1985, Camarena stepped out of the U.S. consular offices in Guadalajara to meet his wife for lunch. He never arrived. Agents of the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, Mexico's own federal security directorate, which had long since been compromised by cartel money, intercepted him on the street, forced him into a waiting vehicle, and disappeared into the city traffic. The abduction lasted less than 60 seconds. He was taken to a private residence at 881 Lope de Vega Street, a property belonging to a cartel collaborator on an otherwise unremarkable street in a residential neighborhood. What happened inside those walls over the next 36 hours represents one of the most extensively documented acts of torture in the history of organized crime. Caro Quintero and his co-conspirator, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known throughout the underworld as Don Neto, personally supervised the opening phase of the interrogation. They wanted names. They wanted to understand how the DEA had infiltrated their operation at such a granular level. They wanted to know who had talked. The physical assault began immediately. Camarena's ribs were fractured one by one. His teeth were extracted with pliers. Objects were forced into his body, causing internal rupturing. Each time the agent lost consciousness from the pain, and he did repeatedly, a physician named Humberto Alvarez Machain was present to revive him. Adrenaline injections were administered to override the body's instinct to shut down. The clinical precision of keeping a torture subject alive and conscious for over a day and a half is, in itself, a testament to the premeditation involved. Every moment was recorded on audio tape. Those recordings still exist. They were later used as evidence in multiple federal trials. On the tapes, Camarena's voice can be heard deteriorating, from structured responses to desperate pleas to barely coherent sounds. At one point, he can be heard begging his captors not to harm his family. The response, according to those who have reviewed the recordings, was another blow. When there was nothing left to extract, the decision was made to end the operation. Multiple penetrating wounds were made to Camarina's skull. The final instrument used was a Phillips head screwdriver, driven directly into his brain through one of the perforations already made. He was declared dead on February 9, 1985. His body was buried in a field in Michoacán. When it was recovered weeks later, forensic pathologists made a discovery that has since become one of the most haunting details in the case. There was soil inside his esophagus and in his lungs. Enrique Camarena had been buried alive. The political and institutional fallout was seismic. Operation Leyenda, the DEA's largest ever investigation on foreign soil, was launched almost immediately. It exposed systemic corruption at the highest levels of the Mexican government. Rafael Caro Quintero was eventually captured, not once but twice, the second time in 2022, nearly 4 decades after the murder. The recordings from Lope de Vega Street remain sealed in federal archives, their contents considered too disturbing for unrestricted public access. Chapter 2. The Ball of Skin, Los Mochis, Sinaloa, January 8, 2010. On a cold morning in January 2010, residents of Los Mochis, a mid-sized city in the northern state of Sinaloa, discovered 2 plastic containers left in the middle of a residential street. Inside was a human torso and 4 severed limbs. A short distance away, wrapped in a separate bag, was a soccer ball. Stitched across its surface, with evident care and deliberate precision, was a human face. The victim was later identified as Hugo Hernandez, 36 years old, a low-level operative affiliated with a cartel rival to the Sinaloa organization. That association alone had made him a target. According to forensic reconstruction of the scene, Hernandez had been abducted, transported to a Sinaloa-controlled location, and subjected to dismemberment while still alive. Both arms and both legs were removed with a chainsaw. Medical examiners estimated that the subject retained vital signs through at least the initial stages of the process, a conclusion drawn from the volume and pattern of hemorrhaging at the points of severance. Decapitation followed. The operation was methodical, not frenzied. What distinguished this case from countless other cartel executions was the final act. The meticulous removal of the victim's facial skin, an extremely technically demanding procedure, followed by its systematic resuturing onto the surface of the soccer ball. The stitching was careful. The features were deliberately preserved in a recognizable configuration. A note accompanied the display. Happy New Year, because this will be your last. The case received international coverage within 48 hours. Images circulated across media platforms with and without editorial censorship. The level of calculation involved, the time, the skill, the deliberate craftsmanship of the final presentation, elevated it beyond even the already brutal standard of cartel violence. It was understood universally as a message, not to a government, not to law enforcement, but to every rival organization operating within range of Sinaloa's reach. No individual was ever formally charged for the crime. The territorial indicators and the methodology pointed, according to law enforcement assessments, directly to the organizational structure built by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. No one publicly disputed that conclusion. Chapter 3. The Flaying of Guerrero, Mexico, circa 2010 to 2020. 2012. Some acts of violence are designed to be witnessed, not just by their immediate victims, but by an audience far wider than any courtroom or crime scene. In the contested territories of Guerrero State, a video surfaced that law enforcement analysts and trauma psychologists would later describe as among the most psychologically calculated pieces of cartel intimidation ever recorded. The footage depicts two bound men, a father and his adult son, in the hands of cartel operatives. What follows in the recording is systematic and progressive. Using bladed implements, the captors begin a process of surgical flaying on both subjects while they remain conscious and aware of what is being done. The elder victim is made to witness what is done to his son. The son is made to endure what is done to his father. The deliberate inclusion of a familial relationship in the staging of the act was not accidental. It transformed the recording from a simple execution video into a sophisticated instrument of psychological terror, a demonstration that no boundary of human relationship offered protection, that the cartel's reach extended not merely to individuals, but to the people those individuals loved. The video circulated through encrypted file-sharing networks before eventually being analyzed by federal authorities. It has been linked to territorial disputes between competing organizations in one of Mexico's most violently contested states. The identities of the victims were never officially confirmed. The perpetrators were never publicly charged in connection with this specific act. What the video accomplished, however, was precisely what it was designed to accomplish. It was seen, it was remembered, and in the territories where these cartels operated, it was understood. Chapter 4. The Bridge Hangings. Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, 2011 to 2012. The border city of Nuevo Laredo sits directly across the Rio Grande from Laredo, Texas, one of the busiest land crossing points in the Western Hemisphere, processing billions of dollars in commerce every year. It is also one of the most violently contested urban territories in the history of the Mexican drug war. During the years of peak conflict between the Zetas cartel and its various adversaries, the city's infrastructure became a canvas for public intimidation. Bridges, the structures that literally connected Mexico to the United States, symbols of transit and commerce and human movement, were repurposed as execution theaters. Bodies were suspended from vehicular overpasses in varying states of mutilation, accompanied by narco banners, cloth signs bearing handwritten declarations of cartel affiliation, warnings to rival organizations, and territorial claims. The hangings were timed. They were positioned for maximum visual impact on morning traffic. They were designed to be seen by the maximum number of people before authorities could respond. The strategic logic was transparent to analysts. The objective was not merely to dispose of enemies, but to assert dominance over the city's psychological geography, to make the infrastructure of daily life inseparable from the imagery of cartel violence. Every commuter crossing that bridge, every truck driver passing beneath it, was receiving the same message. This city belongs to us, and its bridges are our billboards. The practice was adopted and replicated across multiple contested municipalities throughout northern Mexico. Federal authorities documented dozens of such incidents during the height of intercartel conflict. Each one generated international media coverage. Each one was, in its brutal way, a success. Chapter 5. The Ritual Heart Tabasco/Jalisco, documented 2017 to 2020. In September 2020, a video emerged in the corners of the internet where cartel content circulates, on encrypted messaging platforms, on Spanish-language blogs dedicated to narco documentation, on file-sharing networks that operate below the threshold of mainstream moderation. Its contents prompted immediate escalation among law enforcement analysts monitoring cartel activity for the CJNG, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The footage, which this documentary will not describe in its full duration, depicts a male subject, presumed to be an operative of a rival organization, bound on a concrete floor. What follows is a live thoracic dissection performed without anesthesia by a cartel operative, while the subject remains conscious. The rib cage is breached with a bladed instrument. The chest cavity is opened. While the victim continues to move, the operative reaches inside, removes the still-functioning heart, and, in a moment of clear, theatrical awareness of the recording, brings it to his mouth. The individuals visible in the footage shout organizational slogans. Pura gente del Mencho. Somos los Jaliscos. Pura nueva generación, pure Menchos people. We are the Jaliscos. Pure new generation. What distinguished this recording from earlier cartel violence was its ritual dimension. The fact that it was not simply an execution, but a performance with symbolic weight. Subsequent testimonies from adolescent recruits who defected from CJNG cells confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect, that acts of cannibalism had been incorporated into initiation rituals within certain cells of the organization. The consumption of an enemy's body, or specifically the organ most symbolically associated with life and strength, was presented to new recruits as a demonstration of absolute commitment and the severing of all prior moral architecture. In 2017, authorities in Tabasco had already detained 12 members of a CJNG cell suspected of similar acts. The 2020 video transformed what had been an unverified rumor into documented reality. The U.S. government formally designated the CJNG as a transnational criminal organization. The cartel's leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, has since become the most wanted drug trafficker in the Western Hemisphere, with a $10 million DEA bounty on his capture. Chapter 6. The Chainsaw Video. Documented viral circulation, 2011. In 2011, a video appeared online that became one of the most widely circulated pieces of cartel execution footage in the history of social media. It depicted a man, alive, kneeling, conscious, being executed with a chainsaw while a group of cartel operatives stood around him, delivering what amounted to a scripted, territorial declaration. What made the recording significant beyond its immediate horror was its production context. This was not clandestine documentation. There was staging. There was lighting consideration. The camera maintained a deliberate angle. The men speaking were composed. They were performing for an audience they knew would watch. The video spread across early social media platforms, news aggregators, and file-sharing sites within hours of its upload. Attempts at removal were outpaced by re-uploads. By the time major platforms instituted content moderation protocols capable of addressing material of this nature at scale, the video had already been viewed millions of times. This represented, in the assessment of media scholars and cartel analysts alike, a fundamental shift in the methodology of narco-terror. violence had always been designed to communicate. But the deliberate production and release of execution footage as a form of psychological warfare, distributed through public platforms to a global audience, marked the cartel's conscious adoption of modern media infrastructure as a weapon. The chainsaw video was not the first of its kind. It was, however, the moment the strategy achieved undeniable proof of concept. Authorities identified the video as originating from the ongoing conflict between rival organizations in northern Mexico. No formal prosecution was ever publicly linked to the specific footage. Chapter 7. The Pozolero, Tijuana, Baja California, 1984 to 2009. In 1984, a bricklayer from Tijuana named Santiago Meza Lopez received a job offer from Teodoro Garcia Cimental, a mid-level enforcer in the Tijuana cartel known as El Teo. The offer was straightforward: $600 per week to make bodies disappear. Meza accepted. What began as an occasional transactional arrangement metastasized over the following 2.5 decades into what can only be described as an industrial disposal operation. Meza's method was chemical. He would receive cadavers already killed by cartel sicarios, dismember them into manageable sections, and submerge the pieces in 200-liter steel drums half filled with water and 250-kilo sacks of caustic soda. Sodium hydroxide, the chemical at the heart of industrial drain cleaning. The exothermic reaction brought the solution to a sustained boil. Over approximately 24 hours, maintained at high heat, the organic matter, flesh, muscle, connective tissue, would fully dissolve into a dense, viscous liquid. What the chemical process could not fully eliminate, teeth, fingernails, bone fragments, was separated, doused with gasoline, burned in a vacant lot, and buried. Meza operated primarily at a site known as La Guerrero, in the Ejido Maclovio Rojas, on the outskirts of Tijuana. The facility had been fitted with a rudimentary drainage system. The dissolved remnants of human beings flowed directly into the city's municipal sewage infrastructure. For years, they vanished without forensic trace. In his subsequent confession, Meza stated he had dissolved 300 bodies. Investigators, considering the full operational span of his work, 25 years, placed their estimates substantially higher, with some assessments ranging into the thousands. He was arrested on January 23, 2009, following intelligence developed through a separate cartel enforcement operation. During his interrogation, he wept. He described the process with the detached vocabulary of a man who had systematized atrocity until it felt procedural. He spoke of providing for his family. He used the language of labor. When excavations began at La Galera in 2011, forensic teams recovered between 14 and 15,000 discrete human bone fragments from multiple burial sites. The concentration of remains was so dense, the intermingling of biological material so complete, that individual identification was rendered all but impossible. The site was eventually sealed. Meza's technique, once considered an outlier, was subsequently adopted across virtually every major Mexican cartel. Chemical dissolution became standard practice for organizations seeking to eliminate evidence of their victims. In March 2024, a federal judge sentenced him to 30 years and 8 months in prison. Hundreds of families in Tijuana have never been told what happened to their missing relatives. Many of them never will be. Chapter 8. 35. Bodies on the Boulevard Veracruz, Mexico, September 8, 2011. By 2011, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel had expanded far beyond its origins in western Mexico. Under the command of El Mencho, the organization was engaged in an aggressive territorial campaign across multiple states, and its next target was the Gulf port city of Veracruz, a strategically vital location for the movement of goods, money, and narcotics. The rival organizations embedded in Veracruz needed to understand what it meant to oppose the CJNG. El Mencho devised a communication strategy proportionate to his ambitions. 35 individuals were identified as members or affiliates of competing criminal organizations operating in the Veracruz corridor. They were abducted across the city over the course of several days, consolidated at CJNG-controlled facilities, and subjected to systematic torture that was, by every available account, conducted not to extract information, but to produce a specific aesthetic outcome. Fingers and hands were amputated. Burns were administered. Bladed instruments were used to carve the word ex rata, informant, traitor, into the skin of multiple victims while they remained conscious. The goal was not confession. It was spectacle. On the morning of September 8th, during peak commuter traffic hours, 35 corpses were deployed across several locations on Veracruz's Boulevard Industrial. 6 bodies were suspended from a vehicular overpass. The remainder were scattered across the primary traffic artery. Narco banners signed by El Tejon and bearing the CJNG insignia were affixed to the bridge structure. The timing, the distribution, the volume, all of it had been orchestrated for maximum civilian exposure. The city stopped moving. International wire services had photographs on their platforms within hours. The Mexican federal government was forced to publicly acknowledge the scope of the event. The United States government, which had been monitoring CJNG's expansion with escalating concern, moved to formally designate the organization as a transnational criminal organization, a classification that opened a broader range of interdiction and prosecution authorities. Scott Stewart, an analyst at the strategic intelligence firm Stratfor, stated publicly that the Veracruz operation demonstrated an extreme level of savagery, a phrase notable for the context in which it was offered, given the already catastrophic baseline of violence characterizing the wider drug war. A former senior DEA official, writing in Rolling Stone, described El Mencho as a sociopath, functioning without the inhibitions that had constrained even his most brutal predecessors. The Veracruz mass disposal became the defining symbolic moment in the CJNG's rise to dominance. Within a decade, the organization would surpass the Sinaloa cartel in geographic reach, and by multiple assessments, in the raw ferocity of its methods. Epilogue: the architecture of terror: 8 cases, 8 methods, each one documented in federal courtrooms, forensic laboratories, and the sealed testimony of protected witnesses, each one a node in a deliberate system. Kiki Camarena was tortured for 36 hours because the cartel needed information, and because his death needed to communicate something to every other undercover agent who might consider following in his footsteps. Santiago Mesa dissolved an estimated 1,000 or more human beings because disappearance itself is a weapon, inflicting grief without resolution, denying families the mercy of certainty. The soccer ball stitched with Hugo Hernandez's face, the bodies on the Veracruz Boulevard, the video from Jalisco posted for the world to find. These were not crimes committed in the shadow of darkness. They were broadcasts. That is the architecture of this terror. It is not chaos. It is communication. It is a language written in bodies and distributed through fear, designed to paralyze rivals, corrupt institutions, and erode the psychological infrastructure of civil society itself. The DEA, the U.S. Department of Justice, and their Mexican federal counterparts have invested billions of dollars and decades of institutional effort attempting to dismantle the organizations responsible for these acts. Some of the architects of this violence, Caro Quintero, El Chapo Guzman, El Pozolero, are in prison. Others, including El Mencho, remain at large, commanding organizations that continue to operate across dozens of countries. The war is not over. The messages are still being sent. And somewhere, in a courtroom, or a federal archive, or an evidence locker, the documentation of the next chapter is already being collected.